My name's Dave Cooper and I'm a psychotherapist and in Christian ministry. And if this is the first time you've seen any of these videos, then I want to say thank you for taking the time. They're primarily aimed at Christians who are struggling with different issues, obsessions, compulsions, addictions, depression, anxiety. But if you're still wondering about those things, if you're still not sure what you are or what your faith you have or anything, I believe you can still get a lot of value from these things. Whatever you're trying to achieve in your life, however you're trying to make progress spiritually, then I've labeled here 4 or 5 things that I believe are vital to your understanding, things you need to be convinced of before you start to make any progress. So take a look at them and see whether your thinking in ways that you struggled in your life has not included some of these ideas. So there it is. I hope you enjoy it. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Welcome to Transformed. So, I want to do this video today on making spiritual progress. And I think it's really important for people to understand when they try and do this, that there are certain things that stand in the way. And so what I'd like to do is maybe have 4 or 5 headings that really describe those roadblocks and those things that are in the way, and some insight into helping us to get by them. Certainly helping us to take them seriously and not sort of poo-pooing them or try and do without them. So let me give you a list of that. I have a list of it here. And I say that these are things that you must be convinced of. And you must be convinced that, number 1, that you should be making spiritual progress. I guess that's the first and most basic idea that says you ought to be, that there is a natural idea, a requirement even, for you to become authentically you, is to actually be going forwards, to be overcoming, to be making progress. The next thing that you should be convinced of in order to put yourself or set yourself in the right orientation to make progress is that you should realize that you do not see yourself in a biblical way. I think this is so important because it takes account of the strength and the nature of our cultural position. The idea that you would try to make progress, but not realize that you're not even seeing yourself as you were designed to be, but that culture, which I believe we are literally saturated in, it may have escaped your attention that you've been trained to see yourself a certain way. So it really needs attention. The third thing that I think you should be convinced about is that something has replaced the biblical view of yourself, the human condition, the human nature. Something quite deliberate. It's not just that you don't see yourself this way. It's that something has deliberately imposed itself upon your view. And that thing, well, it's getting worse. And because it's getting worse, the chances are that it gets more and more difficult to see yourself as you were designed to be. So the fourth thing I think you need to be convinced that is that this thing is complicated. In other words, that we can't just look at things in a black and white way. I often say to my clients that if everything in the world that looked good was good, and if everything in the world that looked bad was bad, there really would be no problems with anything, would there? It's it's like those old cowboy films, and the guy's wearing black and the guy's wearing white, and it's so obvious who's the goodies and who's the baddies, right? Well, when you look at the sort of things that we hold up, quite rightly, to be the correct things, the most beneficial things, the things that are above, and we'll also look at the things that are animalistic and basic and not affording us any progress. If those two things were completely separate, I think it would be very simple. But there is a crossover, and we're going to go into that because you have to take that into account. Otherwise, you start adding to the confusion rather than clarifying. So the first of the things that we should be convinced about, I believe, is that we should be making progress. So we're going to talk a little bit now about what is progress, why should we be making it, what's the idea here, and how can we be confused about this a little bit. So I would say that this is complicated, and even though it might seem obvious to you that we should be making progress, we need to check a few things out. Romans 8 verse 29 says that we should be conformed to the image of his Son, the Father's Son. So that's Jesus. And this may not be the idea of growth that you'd been considering. If you've got particular problems like we all do, and you say, no, my issue is pornography, my issue is gambling, my issue is drinking, my issue is relationship with others, or whatever it is that's going on for you, it's so specific, but it takes your attention and your focus away from your actual growth context. And the growth context is there in Romans 8, verse 29. You should be conformed or being conformed as a process to the image of his Son. Now, if you're looking in your life to be stronger or, more successful, richer, more dominant, or any of these specific things, or if you're looking to defeat or get, have dominion over your issues, then what you've done is, I believe you've confused spiritual growth for carnal growth. And these are two things that we're going to separate more and more as we go on. So what I'm saying is that a Christian grows by becoming more like Christ, more pure, more righteous. I have here 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10, which describes really the trap of mistaking one for the other, which we all do at times. Verse 10 says, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." It's saying that there's a trap. Of course, money here is translated as money. It's lucre, it's the world, it's the idea of carnal growth or dominion. And what it's saying is that it's a trap that you fall into because you've mistaken what growth is. You see, your flesh, or what we will come to call your brain, just to separate these two things very simply, your mind, the front room, and your brain, the back room, your brain derives really very simple fleshly objectives. It's really interested primarily in three things: your safety, your security, and your comfort. Those are the three things it's interested in, and specifically yours. Nothing to do with other people. So in some, of course, when we talk about safety, there's a complication there because your training then has told you what, or has trained your brain as to what is safe and what isn't. And that can translate as more like power or fame or riches or influence. So that's often confused, I would say, with genuine growth. But the two actually will never mix. You can't ever mix these two. We're going to learn later on about certain types of overlap, but essentially they don't mix. My first job when I left school was of an offset lithographer, in other words, a printer. I entered an apprenticeship for printing. And it was very hard work, and I didn't stick to it. I went to art college in the end. But what I learned, the first thing I learned in my job was that oil and water do not mix. And that's the basis on which we can get accurate and clean printing by using this principle of oil and water don't mix. Well, I would say that this is exactly the same for the spirit and the flesh. They simply do not mix. You can't mix them. It's Galatians 5:17 actually that really helps us understand this. It says that the flesh is always seeking for things that are non-spiritual, and the spirit is always seeking for things that are non-fleshly. In other words, what we learn is that our flesh is always going to seek fleshly things, and our spirit is always going to seek spiritual things. They don't mix, they don't cross over. And this is really important to understand. And there's so much confusion here with this, because many people I talk to, you'll hear them say this. You probably maybe said it yourself, They'll say, I just want to be happy. I just want to be happy. That's all I want. Like it's easy or something. Like happiness, not only, is simple but easy, but it isn't. And the worst thing about that aim is that it's misguided. Happiness is an effect. It's not a cause. You don't seek it. It emerges as the result of a good life. So it's misguided in the first place. But I think, we go back to this 1 Timothy chapter 6 here. Verse 6 of chapter 6 says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. And that is the idea of how we can separate these two things, because contentment through being conformed more to the image of his Son is what brings all these other things. Again, Philippians 4 verse 7 talks about God's peace as being beyond all understanding. And what that means is that it doesn't make sense, right? And what it means by not making sense is that from your fleshly perspective, it doesn't make sense that you would be peaceful or at peace, because you will not necessarily have what your flesh desires, but you will have peace because it's God's peace and it's in the spirit and they don't mix, right? So that's, when we talk about the importance of this and how you might confuse the two and how you might then simplify and clarify, you go all the way to Matthew, all the way back to Matthew 6:33, and Jesus says, look, your Father knows you need all these things, right? Whether, what the clothes you wear, your security, all of that stuff that your flesh needs, your Father knows you need all these things, but seek first the kingdom of God. In other words, get across to the spiritual side and make that your aim, make that your growth, because all these things, if you do that, all these other things will be added to you. So what are we saying here? We're saying understand what growth is and that you should be making it. So if we look at a tree grows by getting bigger. In more branches, more leaves, more height. That's what we tend to think of as growth. But a church grows, and you, because you're the temple, you grow the same way as a church, a church grows by becoming more pure. Not by getting bigger in numbers, not by getting a bigger building or a bigger stage or more congregants. A church grows by becoming more pure. So it can actually lose numbers and become a better church. And you're the same. You grow by becoming more righteous and more pure. And so understanding that and understanding that growth is what God wants for us is the first stage. How do you see yourself? When you think of you, one of the things, or it's certainly the second step of making spiritual progress here is, I would say, is that you need to be convinced that you do not see yourself as the Bible sees you. You don't understand yourself as the way God created you. And we can lose this very, very easily. So the question, how do you see yourself, is really important. Ephesians 2 verse 10 says that you are God's masterpiece. So when you think of yourself, does the word masterpiece come up a lot for you? Or maybe some other words? In some versions it says that you're God's workmanship, but of course God's workmanship is a masterpiece. But to understand yourself, who you are, as being at the very pinnacle of God's creation, I think that's quite difficult, and I think it's quite easy to lose. It's quite easy to stop thinking of yourself that way. I've got 1 John here, and it's chapter 3 and verse 2 that I probably want to read in its entirety, because it's so important that we understand how we can lose and maybe have lost this view of ourselves. Verse 2 says, "Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure." Remember, we talk about conforming ourselves to the image of Christ. So let me ask you this. When you think about your growth, your progress, what you need, what you want, is your focus on the outside or is it on the inside? Where is your focus when you look to achieve, when you look to grow? Do you see your problems and your growth as relating to external things? What you need, what you want, what you should have, or internal things, how you are? What is your state? So here we enter what we might call, I would call a psychotherapeutic principle. It may even be a spiritual principle. I say to my clients a lot, everything starts with your state. Everything starts with your state. So it's Matthew 7 verse 17 where Jesus explains this. He says that good trees don't bear bad fruit, and bad trees don't bear good fruit. In other words, he's saying that the quality of everything you do and everything you produce is dictated by the quality of your state. So that's a spiritual perspective. And it's absolutely fascinating because we can get so connected with what we want to do, achieve, and how it reflects back on who we are and so on. We're identifying that we forget that the quality of our state is what dictates the quality of that outcome. See, that's not a fleshly perspective. That's a spiritual perspective. And remember, they will never meet. They'll never interact. Because if you approach your growth and your progress from a fleshly perspective, that perspective will not be concerned with your state. It wouldn't care less about your state, just cares less about the outcome. What do you achieve? How do you end up? What does it look like? You know? Whereas the spiritual perspective says, well, we want a spiritual outcome. And so we start with our state. You know, it's Matthew 16, verse 26, where Jesus explains this. He says, what actually is it going to profit you if you gain everything? If you achieve everything in the world, but actually you lose your soul? What he's saying is that you forget who you are when you pursue these things so much. So a child of God is who you are. That's not an identification, that is who you are. But if you have identified too much with the things of this world, identity is like when somebody asks you a question, who are you? And you say, well, I'm an architect, or I'm a musician, or, you know, and you think of who you are as what you've achieved in the world and so on. what you do and what you own are carnal or fleshly perspectives, then basically you've lost who you are. You've forgotten who you are. And you've entered really what we call the world's system. And so what does that look like and how does that appear? Well, what that looks like is exactly what we're going to explore in the next section. So, if we are no longer seeing ourselves as God made us, as God designed us, then what's replaced it? It's not a vacuum. Something has replaced our view of ourselves. And I'm going to argue that thing is quite intentional, it's cultural, and it's quite evil. Now, what do we call it? What is this thing that I'm going to describe? Well, in the Bible, it's called man's wisdom. In other words, we've replaced God's wisdom with man's wisdom. And it's 1 Corinthians 3:19 that talks about this. It says, "For the wisdom of man is folly to the Lord." And it basically, what it's saying is the very best thing that we can do is nowhere near his wisdom and his righteousness. Now, that's not to say that we haven't achieved great things and that we don't do good things. We do. And to help us understand the difference here, I think we need to make a distinction. So first of all, we're going to name what we're talking about. And what we're talking about, I would call the medical model. I've said a lot about this in other places, but basically, I'm going to cover the basics here and say, what is the harmful nature of the medical model? Well, I would make a clear distinction, and I would say that anything that we can see under a microscope is generally where the medical model has helped us. Brilliant men have committed themselves and dedicated themselves to finding cures for viruses and for illnesses and difficulties. Anything you can see under a microscope, I could say, has been helpful. Where we make the distinction is where the medical model has wandered into the areas that cannot be seen under a microscope. And of course, we're talking about all of these mental conditions, so-called, that include addiction, anxiety, depression, all of these things that the medical model has absolutely got hold of, and not just in the sense that it's made, big pharma is the most incredible business. It's so huge, but it's also got into our psyche in the sense this is the way you now are likely to be viewing yourself. This is the way you will likely to be thinking of yourself. Now, if you want to go into this more deeply, I will leave links in the description, but for now, I'll just cover the basics. And I will say that the pharma business, big pharma, is huge in carnal terms, in terms of the hundreds of billions of dollars it's worth annually. But there is a strange thing about it. Now, I'm not expert enough to say if it's the only business like this, but it seems like it may be the only business in the world like this where in order to grow, it has to fail. If it was succeeding, it would be shrinking. If it was working, right? But it's not working. And the strange thing about it not working is that it's actually growing as a result of not working. Every year in the DSM, they come up with more mental conditions, more issues that we name and we diagnose. And Big Pharma says, yeah, I can develop a pill for that. Now, how does this affect the way we view ourselves? Well, if you think about the medical model in all its different forms, whether it's psychiatry, psychology, the medical doctors and so on, it always starts from the same place. And that place is this: what seems to be the trouble? If you went to the doctor and the doctor said, well, what can I do for you? And you said, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, the doctor would have nothing to say to you. So I want to ask you to ask yourself, is that how you start to think about yourself? When you think about yourself and who you are, and what you need to do to make progress and what you need to do to grow as a person? Do you start from the position, from the medical position, from man's wisdom by saying, what's wrong with me? What is it in me that needs fixing? What is it in me that I need to get rid of? What is it in me that's bad, and so on? Now, very interesting here that if you start that way, which is not the way God thinks of you, right? Not the way you've been designed, but what it does when you start that way, and by the way, don't think of this as a small thing. The medical model, I believe we are saturated in it as a culture. I believe we are soaked in it to such an extent we can't actually see it. Or put another way, it has convinced us as a culture that this is the way to view ourselves, not just one way to view ourselves. And I think that's a very important question. So what does it do? When we set up that idea, when we start our thinking from that point, it sets up what I call the conflicted self. It sets you up in a battle with yourself. And that is not that doesn't bring peace beyond all understanding, does it? So that's the problem with it. If you say that to make progress is to become more pure, more righteous, then what we are headed for is the harmonized self. What this does, what the medical model does, is it leads us into the conflicted self. And it's very important that we understand this. Not just that the medical model does this, but how do we understand this biblically? Where have we gone wrong? What is the problem with this? Well, if you think about what the Bible has been saying for thousands of years, in a way, it's quite simple. It's saying, look, you have two parts of you. You have within you, and as a corporate self, you have the flesh and you have the spirit. And they both reside within you. And yes, of course, the Bible does say that, more modern versions certainly says that there is a constant battle raging between them. And the Bible does use a lot of fighting talk. And I think that, of course, the Bible is correct. But I think what we do when we read it, and sometimes when we're taught about it as well, is we get more involved with the medical model than we realize when we forget that the fighting talk in the Bible is a metaphor. It's a metaphor, all right? In other words, it's talking about it as being in opposition. When it says in conflict, what it means is that they're in opposition. If you read older versions, older translations of the Bible, the language tends to be a bit more measured. You know, instead of saying there's a constant battle raging between these two parts of you, older versions say that they are in opposition, which they are. Of course they are. They're in absolute opposition. It's oil and water. They don't mix. They're going in separate directions. But as soon as you take that idea of fighting, of there being a battle going on, too literally, as soon as you think of that as an actual battle, not just a metaphorical battle, then you have lined yourself up inadvertently with the medical model that says there are things in you that we need to be fixing, we need to be getting rid of, we need to be expunging. So effectively, the medical model and the what we might call the biblical, or more rightly, the church model, they end up in the same place. They look at parts of you, and one of them wants to demonize it, and the other one wants to pathologize it, but they both want to get rid of it. Now, there's a problem with this, and I think once we get into this idea of what's the difference between a metaphorical idea and a literal idea, then I think we will understand it. You see, we used to use these, I don't know if you remember these big badges that were out around about the 70s or so. It said, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And I think, we started off this whole YouTube video thing by saying we are going to be conformed in the likeness of the Son, which is the same thing. what would Jesus do? Well, I want to take you to Matthew 7, verse 11. And anyone who's worked with me knows that I go on about this because if you go back to Matthew 5, you will understand that in Matthew 7, Jesus is teaching the disciples. Some people mistake this because a large crowd had gathered, and we can mistake it and think that he's teaching the large crowd. Actually, he's teaching the disciples here, the very 12 people or 11 people that formed Christianity. You know, we're all Christians today because of what these 11 people did. So that's very, very important. But a large crowd did gather and they were listening. But what did he say to them? It's fascinating to me that he called the disciples evil to their face, right? You can check it out for yourself. He says, if you then who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more? And so on. You can read it for yourself. But essentially, I want you to get the important part here. He's talking to the people that he chose after a night of prayer to be part of his inner circle that's going to take Christianity out into the world. And millions of people today are Christians because of what they did. And yet, he calls them evil. Because they were. Of course they were evil. They were carnal, fleshly people just trying to do their best in the world like we all are. And it took him 3.5 years to teach them how to cross into the kingdom of God and to be more spiritual. And so I'm asking you to consider, what did Jesus do? And I'm asking you to be conformed in the likeness, and I'm asking you to do the same thing with the evil in you that Jesus did with the evil in the disciples. In other words, what did Jesus do? Well, he worked with them. Of course, it was in a sense against them because he was correcting them, he was teaching them, he was discipling them. And that's exactly what I'm suggesting you do. But you don't do that by rejecting them. You don't do that by literally fighting them and getting rid of them or denying them and pretending they don't exist, which some people are tempted to do. You have evil within you. And as long as you're living and breathing in this body, you will have, because it's a sinful nature. And the Bible talks about it quite explicitly. And, you have to go to something like Romans 7, verse 20, when Paul is writing so coherently about this and so simply. You can really understand it once you read it properly, where he's saying, look, if I keep doing what I don't want to do, in other words, my authentic self, my spiritual self, who I really am, I don't want to do that. But if I keep doing it, then it's not me that's doing it. What? What does that mean? Well, what he's saying is it's the sinful nature within me. In other words, there are two motivations. They are oil and they are water, and they do not mix. And one of them wants this and one of them wants that. And you have to ask yourself how clearly and how perfectly it lines up with the medical model when you say to yourself, well, that's just because there's something wrong with me, right? I keep doing these things. I keep drinking when I don't want to drink. I take drugs. I say I'll never do it again. I say, I'm never going to get angry again, but then I do it. All of these things that's out of control in your life, all of these things that you want to grow through, all of these things that the medical model has told you you've got to get rid of, or you've got to deny, or, buy another self-help book or whatever it is. These are things that the Bible has understood for thousands of years and has been teaching you for thousands of years are part of your nature. And what Jesus has shown us to do is to work with those parts of us and disciple them. Not because we hate them, but because we love them. Now, I know this is going to sound very, very strange and weird to you who've been desperately trying to fight these things off for years and have failed, right? And that's the key word, right? If it was working, then I would say, great, carry on. But I'm talking to people for whom it is not working. So I'm giving you a different approach here. And I think it's one of the things you need to be convinced of. And it's biblical Jesus did it. We need to do it. Where he discipled people, I want to encourage you to do what I call inner discipling. I want you to work with the sinful nature within you and do exactly what Jesus did with the disciples. What did he actually do? Well, he spent 3.5 years getting them to trust him. Basically, his entire message is that Jesus is saying, you can trust me. Now, I want you to consider saying that to the sinful nature within you, to say, you can trust me. Now, when you achieve that, and it takes a little work, right, even as it did in Jesus' case, but the benefits are huge because you immediately start to step towards what we call a harmonized self rather than a conflicted self. Okay? So, again, when you read that fighting talk in the Bible, realize it's metaphorical. Okay? No one ever got stabbed by the sword of truth. Okay? Let me give you a famous example, right? Possibly the most famous parable of all was Jesus talking about the parable of the sower. Now, you've probably heard all this, the 4 types of ground and everything and sowing the seed. Have you ever read that or listened to a sermon on the parable of the sower and been offended because you're being described as dirt? In that parable, you are dirt. Or, admittedly, you're the good soil, but you're being described as soil, but you never think to yourself, oh, I'm being called dirt here, because it's a metaphor. And it's the same thing with this language of the battle. It's not an actual battle, it's just an opposition. And you have to ask yourself, more importantly, what did Jesus do when he was faced with that opposition? Well, he took the evil nature of 11 or 12 people or more, and he converted them by getting them to trust him. And the proof, you have to go forward to John 5, and I think it's verse 15 where he says, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. Right? And you think, so he's calling evil his friend. So this is fascinating, isn't it? Right? But I think this is one of the steps that you need to be convinced of, is that the way you view yourself has become tainted by the medical model or man's wisdom. So here we are at the 4th idea that I think you need to be convinced of. And the 4th thing is that we need to be convinced that it's complicated because of crossover. In other words, what is it that appears to be have a foot in both camps of the spiritual and the fleshly? So if all things that appeared to be good or looked good were good, and if everything that looked bad was bad, well, there'd be no problem, would there? Everything would be simple, and we'd be able to make decisions very, very easily, like the old cowboy films, where some of them were black and some of them were white, and it was pretty obvious who was the goodie and who was the baddie, right? But life isn't like that. When I left school, one of the first jobs I had was as an offset lithographer, which is a printer. And I learned this principle of printing, which is that oil and water never mix. Now, it's like that with the spirit and the flesh. The Bible teaches us that they never mix. And so, if you're going to do something for a fleshly or from a fleshly perspective, or from a sinful perspective, as the Bible would say, then it's always going to go for fleshly stuff. And if you do something with a spiritual motivation, it's always going to go for spiritual stuff. And the two never ever cross over. But if I drew 2 circles and I asked you to put all the good things in one circle and all the bad things in the other circle, you'd probably do a pretty good job of it, and you would end up with a functioning list based on common sense as to what is good and what is bad. But this can be very misleading because it's so very basic. So how do we get rid of this good and bad label and look a little deeper? Well, we have to see things from a different perspective. I would say a more biblical perspective. In other words, we start to ask ourselves, what is the motivation? Not what we do, but why are we doing it? And if our motivation is fleshly, then the Bible is telling us that our outcome and our aim will always be fleshly. And if our motivation is spiritual, then our outcome and our aim will always be spiritual, even though the two don't fit in these two circles. So this idea is slightly more complex, which is about the idea of where is it coming from? What is our motivation? So say, for instance, we push these two circles together. This is what we call overlap. In other words, even with a fairly basic interest in this stuff, without looking too deeply, we can see quite easily that some things could easily be in either circle, depending on what your motivation is. We can do something that would really be in the good circle, but for a very bad reason. And we can do something that should really be in the bad circle, but we definitely had a spiritual motivation in doing it. Now, because we don't view things this way, or because we don't take that challenge, I think this is where some of the poor teaching, for instance, comes from, and the poor thinking comes from, because we end up with this kind of good and bad simplistic idea. And it can lead to, shall we say, I don't know whether you call it mamby-pamby sort of teaching, where it's all about, everything's sort of nice and gentle and kind, and we get into trouble because some things look very good and they're very bad for us, and some things look very bad but actually they're very good for us. And sorting that out and understanding when are we to do these things and when are we to shy away from them, and so on and so forth. This is what makes things complicated, and this is what I'm calling crossover. So I think there are three ways to understand this that will help, and I think they are proportion, motivation, and suffering. Three general headlines, and I will go through them one at a time and talk about them and the way that they might help you to understand how to not get into trouble here as you try and make that progress. So what do we mean by proportion? Well, if you think about the spirit and the flesh, and again, we simplify that down as the mind and the brain, and we simplify that down as the front room and the back room. This is how simple I want you to keep it as you start to work with what is basically the most complex thing in the universe, which is between your ears. So we need to simplify it down to make progress and to really understand it. Now, when you think about those two rooms, and there's so much to talk about there, but I'm going to keep it very simple here and say responses come from the front row and reactions come from the back room. So the first thing to do is to separate those two and say, well, if I'm responding to something, and responses are considered, they're thoughtful, they include a moral dimension, they have ethical complications. Reactions, on the other hand, which come from the brain, the back room, the flesh, they are not considered, they don't have any moral aspect, and they are reactions. Like when the doctor taps your knee and what we call a knee-jerk reaction, right? You can't help it, and that's part of the problem. So one of the first things we understand, and of course we're keeping state here at the center of our understanding, what happens when we make a distinction here, because we need to know when we're acting out of the spirit and when we're acting out of the flesh. Well, a response is in proportion, but a reaction is out of proportion, often. And so that is one of the first ways to understand this and to make progress with it, is when we say, that, or when Paul writes in Romans 7, when I do something I don't want to do, it's not me that's doing it, it's my sinful nature. Well, the neuroscience of that these days, as it's helped us to understand it, is that is your brain reacting. Now, it always reacts the same way. It reacts because of threat, it takes over, which it can do, and it acts to protect you, because it's only concerned with your safety, your security, and your comfort. Remember that, right? So the first thing to look out for is proportion. It's saying, well, if my circumstances are like this size and my response is this size, well, it's in proportion to what's going on. But if my circumstances are like this and my reaction is like this, well, I know my flesh is getting involved and there's no progress in that. Your flesh, your brain is not interested in growth at all. It's only interested in your safety. So the only place where growth comes from, and of course we're talking about spiritual growth. And so spiritual growth, which is to become more pure, more righteous, that only comes from the Spirit. And so it has to be a response, not a reaction. Now that's not the same way, it's not the same thing as saying we can avoid reactions altogether, because we can't. Actually, that's the point, that's what Paul is talking about. He's saying you've got a sinful nature and deal with it, because you're never going to get rid of it as long as you're on this earth. So proportion, when you start to look at the issues that you want to overcome and you want to deal with, and you want to be transformed by the renewing of your mind, as Romans 12:2 says, then the first thing you're looking for is proportion. You're saying, so now every time I see myself act out of proportion, then I know that it's not a good idea to be making big decisions at that moment. I need to change my state first. I need to take a moment and I need to say, well, if I try and produce anything from this state, it's not going to look too good. So proportion is our first step. Motivation is the second idea here, because why we do what we do is more important sometimes than what we do. When you start to be courageous and you start to look at your motivation and say, well, why am I wanting this? Why am I doing this? And you start to take what we call the observer position. Again, there's so much more to know about that, but that's for another time. You take that position by observing yourself, and you say, you ask those questions that say, am I in proportion right now? That say, what is my motivation here? What am I trying to achieve? And again, that really helps you understand the difference between your flesh and your spirit, because the spiritual motivation is always in the spirit, and the fleshly motivation always comes from the flesh, and those two will never ever mix. Okay, so understanding your motivation and being honest with yourself, and it is a courageous step, because anything you do spiritually, no one else will ever see. Only you and God will know about it, and that's part of the difficulty. It's part of what makes it a narrow gate, is because we're very interested, or at least our flesh is very interested, in what looks good, what in appearance over reality. And when you deal with things in the spirit, it's always reality, but it doesn't always appear that good. So of those three steps, we've looked at the idea of proportion and motivation. But now we just need to take a quick look at suffering as well. John 16:33, where Jesus promises that as long as you're in this world, you're going to have trouble. And I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. In other versions it says tribulation. But take heart, I have overcome the world. So the idea of suffering is intrinsically linked with being in the Spirit. Because you can't avoid trouble, you can't avoid suffering. And what's more, if you are making a choice, which of course comes from the front room, because it's a response, not a reaction. So you're making a conscious choice to follow Christ, or a conscious choice to grow as a person, a conscious choice to make progress in the Spirit, then you will always be choosing the tougher path. So let me just make that really clear. To make progress, to grow, you will have to suffer. If you think about what the back room wants, what your flesh wants, which is comfort, safety, security, that will often encourage you through reacting to make choices that are easier, that are more comfortable. And the Bible warns about getting too comfortable, right? But that is another way to really make a distinction between which part of me is running the show here, right? If you think about making progress, let's give you an analogy here to help. If you have been sitting on a couch for years and you say, right, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to get fit, right? So now we're making an analogy from spiritual fitness to physical fitness. Okay. You can pay the gym membership and still sit on the couch. You can pay the gym membership and go to the gym and just sit in the sauna or sit in the coffee bar. But if you pay for your membership and go to the gym and use the machines, you will suffer. It's going to hurt, right? There's no way to make progress without it hurting. But the benefit of that hurting is something you will choose because you will see in your wisdom that in the future it's going to benefit you. In other words, it's pain with gain, right? What we don't want is pain without any gain, right? So take it back to spiritual fitness now. It's exactly the same. In order to grow, you have to suffer through difficult choices. But your wisdom will tell you that it's worth it because of the benefit in the future. So those are the three, and again, there's so much more to this, but I just wanted to give you a start on this, that we're looking at proportion and motivation and suffering. If you focus on those three things, that will really help guide you over to the Spirit and make sure that you're not just pushing away, trying to make progress in the flesh. So there it is. I hope that you got and will get so much from that. I would want you to, and I would encourage you to continue your study through some more of the material that I produce and through your own reading and your own scriptural understanding. But what we've done on this video is we've brought together and focused in on a lot of ideas around the idea of making progress. And we've uncovered a lot of ways in which you might be becoming frustrated, or how you might feel like you've been failing, maybe for a long time. And it may be because you're on the wrong track here. And I've shown several ways in which to get you back on the right track. So I hope that helps. Until next time, be blessed. So, as I say, there are several aspects to this, and I will be putting chapter headings below so that you can go to any of the subjects that I mention. If, as part of your appreciation for this, you want to support the channel, then I welcome you to do so. I will also leave details below of my Patreon page so that you can learn about the courses that I do and the teaching that I give. In the meantime, if you want to connect with me, I'll also put an email address below so that you or your church can connect up with me, and we'll see where we go from there.